Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to do a review of the PowKiddy RGB20SX. Now this essentially is a vertical form factor of the RGB30, one of my favorite devices of last year. Now what I liked about that device and this one as well is the screen. This one has a square aspect ratio and a 720 by 720 resolution, and that scales really well for certain systems. In fact, when it comes to playing games for under $100, the RGB30 and now the RGB20SX gives you the best screen experience for certain systems like Game Boy, Game Boy Color, I would even argue Game Boy Advance, and then also Super Nintendo, TurboGrafx-16, Pico 8, the list just goes on and on. Now, over the past year, every time I've brought up the RGB30, which is pretty often because I really like that device, I often have to bring up its physical shortcomings. You know, the controls aren't the best, it also gets a little bit warm, and the charging is a little bit unintuitive as well. And so in addition to checking out the new form factor of this RGB20SX, I also want to do some testing of those things that I don't like about the RGB30 to see if PowKiddy has made any of those improvements. And long story short, I can say that the RGB20SX definitely has a place for a certain niche of handheld gamers, but I'm not sure if that niche will be a match for you. And so that's what we'll cover here in this video. And without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's get started with the specs, and because this is like the 10th device I've reviewed with the same chipset, we're just going to go over the basics. And this runs the Rockchip RK3566 CPU. This chip is good enough to play all the way up through PlayStation 1 with absolutely no issue, and most Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, as well as PlayStation Portable games will play pretty well. This device also comes with 1GB RAM and a 5000 mAh battery. I found that to give me about 6 to 8 hours of gameplay overall. Of course, the big star of the show is going to be that display. It is 4 inches with a resolution of 720 by 720. And the device also has a fair amount of bells and whistles, including 5 GHz Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, mini HDMI output, as well as a 3.5mm headphone jack. In terms of price, it costs $90 directly on the PowKiddy website, but if you look elsewhere, you can find it for cheaper. For example, on AliExpress via the official PowKiddy store, I found it for $82, and there are a couple sales going on right now. So I was able to apply a $3 off site-wide coupon and then also a $5 off PowKiddy coupon. I'll leave that code down below. Either way, when putting this all together, you can see that it costs $78 right now on AliExpress, so I do expect to be able to find deals here and there. Now let's move on to the unboxing, and first things first, you can see that they've put a new design on the front of the box. And this is pretty cool because PowKiddy generally will leave these things pretty plain and simple. Now, when the device was first available for sale, I bought one for myself to make a review, but then the other day when it arrived, it actually came with 2 different devices. And this was kind of confusing at first. I thought that maybe I'd made the wrong order, but I think it's just that PowKiddy knows my name and address, and now anytime I order something, they throw extra ones in there. So you can take that for what it's worth. You can call this a review unit or the one that I paid for. It's kind of a mix of both. At the very least, it is a net benefit for you as the viewer because I have 2 different colors that I can compare with here in this video. And we'll start with the orange or yellow color. This is the one that I paid for myself. Inside the box, you will get a couple different stickers. Now, this is very similar to the previous RGB20S. We'll go over these stickers here in a minute. Also inside the box, you will get a quick instruction manual that will mostly just talk about the different key combinations. And then finally, we have a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. Next, we'll talk about the device itself and my first impressions. And I think right off the bat, the element that demands the most attention is that really tall screen. It also has the trademark smiley face function buttons here in the center. Some people really like this. And then I also noticed the texture of the plastic's a little bit different. It feels like it has a little bit more grit to it. If anything, I would say that, yeah, it actually feels a little bit higher quality, and maybe the plastic's a little bit thicker and denser as well. Other things I noticed is that the A, B, and XY buttons are pretty close to the bezel, a lot more than I thought they would be. And then finally, this also has the same style of ski slope buttons here on the back. We've seen this with a couple other devices, including those from PowKiddy, and I've never really been a big fan of these. Another thing I noticed while just initially holding the device is that it does feel well balanced. I feel like it's not really lopsided one way or the other. And so I do think that despite the fact that this does look a little bit awkward with such a large screen, I think that it is a well-balanced device. Now for the rest of the video, I'm going to break it up into different segments and talk about specific things relating to this device. We'll start with the controls. And I would say this is probably one of my bigger hesitations when it comes to picking up this device or anything else from PowKiddy. And that's because for the most part, these controls can be either pretty good or really bad. First, we'll start with the positioning, the placement of the D-pad and the analog sticks and whether or not it's comfortable to actually use. And I would say that, yeah, overall, it's actually not half bad. Like I mentioned just previously, it is a lot more balanced feeling than I was expecting. In addition, the device itself feels really well built. In fact, it feels a little bit more premium than most PowKiddy products. They did a pretty good job rounding out the corners on the back. The front is still a little bit more angular, but it's not to the point of actually feeling sharp. And so if I had to make a comparison, I would say it's almost similar to something like an analog pocket, with the exception of those sloped back buttons. If we're talking about a device that kind of feels a little bit premium, especially by PowKiddy standards, it feels like these back buttons are the single thing that's holding them back the most. And we'll talk about these more later, but first I want to get into the D-pad, because this has always been one of the major sticking points of the RGB30. Now, as far as D-pads go, it does feel very typical PowKiddy. By that, I mean that it has a rubber membrane connection that's relatively soft to the touch. It does have a fair amount of pivot to it, but it also feels like the D-pad bottoms out a little bit too much close to the shell. And so I do think the device would benefit if the rubber membrane below it was just a little bit stiffer. Now, in terms of placement of the D-pad, that's fine, but the other thing that I have an issue with is the sharpness of the edges on it. And this, again, is very typical of PowKiddy devices, so if anything, I would say it just hasn't been approved, and it is a little bit sharper on the edges. Now, unfortunately, I can't do a very good comparison between this one and the RGB30, and that's because I've modded my RGB30. I actually took a D-pad and a rubber membrane from an Ambernic device and put them here instead, and so it's not a really good one-to-one comparison. Instead, I think we should just test the RGB20SX on its own by doing some game testing. And we'll start with my signature first test, which is going to be Contra. Here, what I like to do is press down the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And what I'm looking for here is that the character will only move minimally when I push it left and right. And generally, if it moves too much, like you're seeing right here in this footage, that will mean that it's prone to accidental diagonals, and unfortunately, much like the original RGB30, the RGB20SX seems to be along those same lines. Now, thankfully, there are fixes to a setup like this, and I've gone over it in other videos. I'll also leave all that stuff linked down below. What you have to do is actually open up the shell and then put a piece of tape on the D-pad connectors, and then you can usually make it less sensitive. Either way, if you were looking for a plug-and-play experience with non-accidental diagonals, it looks like this device is not going to be a good fit. Now, the second test I like to do is with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, where I like to test whether or not it's Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. And this is an opposite test of the Contra test, where I'm looking to see whether or not it will hit a diagonal when I want. And no surprises here, it's hitting them perfectly fine. Again, this kind of goes part and parcel with it being a little bit overly sensitive. So I would say that the results here are almost identical to the RGB30, and it will take a little bit of modding if you want it to be a more tighter experience. So in a nutshell, yes, this D-pad is typical PowKiddy in that it bottoms out a little bit more than I would like, the rubber membrane is not as stiff as I would like, and the D-pad itself is just a little bit sharp as well. It's not the end of the world, but if you are picky about having accurate controls, this isn't going to be a great fit unless you want to mod it yourself. Next, we'll talk about our menu and function buttons. We have select and start and then function below it. And these little smiley buttons are using a micro switch connection, and they're going to be a little bit loud because of that. So let me give you a quick audio test. Now let's compare it to their previous generation vertical handheld, the RGB20S. So I would say these buttons are quite loud, but they're not as bad as they were previously. Next, we're going to test the face buttons, and these feel pretty good. They're using the same rubber membrane connection as the D-pad, and like with the D-pad, it does feel like the membrane is a little bit soft, but I think it's a pretty good fit here. It gives the device a nice classic feel, and I don't feel like the buttons bottom out either, and so overall, I would say I'm pretty positive about these face buttons. I also think they're a pretty good size, about 8.2 millimeters, which is very similar to the original RGB30, and the nice thing is that these are bigger than the previous generation, which were about a millimeter smaller. Next, we'll try out the analog sticks, which are just using the standard Joy-Con analog sticks that you would find on a Nintendo Switch. So you're probably very familiar with these already, and I don't really see any difference between these and other PowKiddy devices that have come out previously. Now, in terms of input accuracy, I wouldn't have super high hopes with a cheap device like this, but in testing games like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, it definitely got the job done. Maybe not like perfect accuracy like a console controller, but still pretty close. And in terms of positioning, I thought it was going to be a little bit bit awkward to use just because it's so far down in the case, but to be honest, because it's a vertical handheld and you kind of shift your hand around, I didn't really have any issues using this either. I definitely wouldn't want to play a first-person shooter game on this, but overall I think it's going to be just fine for like single or maybe an occasional dual analog stick experience. Next, we'll look at the back buttons, and these are very typical of similar devices you can find on the market. I'm not sure who started this whole ski slope trend here, but I've never been a huge fan of it. I can definitely see the utility in it in that you can rest your index finger on it, but all the same, it does make the device stick out quite a bit. And when you look at the back design, it does look like they are thinking about ergonomics as they put these buttons together. As you can see, the L2 and R2 trigger buttons are bigger than the others, and it does make it pretty easy to differentiate between the two. And so I do appreciate that they are making incremental updates to the overall feel and design, but personally, I wish they just kind of got rid of it altogether. Like I mentioned, when you're gripping the device, you can rest your index finger up above, but I personally don't feel like I need it to be able to grip this device comfortably. And so it almost feels like it's more material than I need for a device, and given the fact that pocketability is an important factor for me, I wish that they just had them a little bit more flush. For example, I would consider this device to be mostly pocketable. I think it's really going to depend on the person and the pants that they're wearing, but yeah, I can fit it in my pocket. The only major issue is that getting it out is kind of a pain because those back buttons will get snagged on your pocket liner. And so in a perfect world, I kind of wish that these buttons were a little bit more flush. It would just make it a more portable design altogether. Now, a common issue with these types of devices is how loud these back buttons are. So let's do a quick audio test. And here they are compared to the RGB20S, which had a more squeaky and mushy feel to it. So overall, I do think that they improved the feel of these buttons. They're definitely more tactile, but they are still a little bit loud. At the end of the day, these back buttons definitely work, and I think that there's no issue when it comes to the functionality of them. It really just has to do with the design and aesthetics overall. And finally, let's talk about the I/O. On the right side, we have our volume up and down buttons, and then we also have a micro SD card slot. This is for the operating system of the device, and it'll come with a 16GB card with every model. On the left side, we have another micro SD card slot. This is where you would put your games card, and then up top, we have our power and reset buttons. Up top, we have a single mini HDMI port, and I did test this. It is working fine. And then finally on the bottom we have two USB-C ports, one for charging and the other one for peripherals, and then between them we have a headphone jack. So that's it when it comes to the controls and I/O. Let's now move into the size and shape of the RGB20SX. We'll start by comparing the two different colors that I have here. You can see the one on the left is a transparent blue, and they rarely will do transparent models. This is a new thing for PowKiddy, and I think it looks pretty good. The device itself has a white PCB that really stands out in the shell, and so yeah, I'm actually a pretty big fan of this design. And I like the feel of the texture and the thickness of the plastic. It does, like with the other one, feel a little bit of a more premium quality. And I also think it's a pretty good shade of blue. Overall, yeah, I'm pretty positive about this design. Now let's check out those stickers that came with the device. Now they gave an old sticker here. This is from the RGB20S. And I have no idea why they packed this into the product because the design of the RGB20S was different. It had the analog sticks up top. And so as a result, the sticker is just not going to work on this device, and so it's a little bit awkward that they put it in there in the first place. Now, thankfully, the other sticker that they made does fit with this device. It's a little bit weird to put on. It's kind of a thin sticker, so you have to be pretty careful when you're applying it. So definitely take your time and make sure you line everything up before you push it down. Now, the animal they used on this one is kind of confusing, so I'm guessing this is supposed to be a musk deer. This is a type of fang deer that you can find throughout South Asia as well as some parts of China, and so I'm thinking that's what they used. Now, one of the interesting features about the musk deer is that it's not a true deer, and one of those distinguishing factors is the fact that it doesn't have antlers. And so you can imagine my confusion when I saw that this sticker has antlers on it, and I'm not really sure why. And I don't know, maybe there is some other animal that looks like a musk deer that also has antlers, but it does look like a bit of a weird design. Especially when you factor in that the antlers, which is the one thing that doesn't belong on a musk deer, actually bleeds through into the screen itself. Now, thankfully, the part of the sticker that covers the screen is just on the bezel, so it's not going to affect gameplay, but it is still a little bit awkward. Anyway, this is what the blue model looks like, and you can church it up with a sticker if you'd like, but personally, I'm going to be taking this off after the video is done. Next, I want to do a couple size comparisons, and the closest comparison I could find in just an equal size was actually the Analog Pocket. And the big old screen on the RGB20S really dwarfs the one on the Analog Pocket, as you can see. Now for a more practical size comparison, here's a Game Boy Color. You can see this one is quite a bit smaller than the RGB20SX. If we want to go even further, here is the Miyoo Mini Plus. This one feels to be about 2/3 the size of the other. Now when it comes to these relatively cheap vertical handhelds on the market, we have quite a few choices. And here are 4 other handhelds that are of similar kind of performance, power, and price point, so let's take a look at these ones. Now the XU10, the RGB20, and then the R36S on the far right, all of those have a lower grade chipset. It's the RK3326. So these devices will not be as performant as the RGB20SX. The only one that's a fair comparison with the same chipset is going to be the Anbernic RG353V. And these two are pretty similar in design, other than the fact that the RGB20SX has that much larger screen. So my big takeaway here is that yes, this is a large device. In fact, it's one of the largest verticals that you can find. And whether or not that's going to be too large for you is going to be all personal preference, but for me, I found it to be surprisingly large, but maybe not unwieldy. And honestly, I think the only reason that it exists in the first place is because there are people who prefer a vertical form factor over horizontal. For me personally, I can totally acknowledge that I'm in the more horizontal camp, and so as a result, this is probably not a good match for my own preferences, but at the very least, I can see why this will appeal to people who like having a vertical form factor. And really, from a design standpoint, I only have one major complaint, and again, it has to do with those back buttons. I think that if they were flush, this would be a much more sleek and premium feeling device. Instead, we get something that's kind of hard to cram into the pocket and even harder to get out. And it becomes more of a problem when you use a device that is more pocketable, for example with the RGB30. Yes, this one has analog sticks and those can get caught in your pocket as well, and it is a rather tall device too, but by comparison, this one is so much easier to slip in and out of your pocket. And so, long story short, I think that PowKiddy did a pretty good job making a fairly balanced vertical handheld in terms of just overall shape and size. But I also feel like they were right on the cusp of really nailing it, and they just didn't quite hit that mark. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about the software experience, and I just want to verify that this is going to be very similar to what we've already experienced with the RGB30. And sure enough, yes, it looks like they are using community software like they were before, but this time they're using Rocknix instead of Jealous. And as you may or may not know, Rocknix is a fork of Jealous because the Jealous project has officially closed. And so it's going to be very similar to the out-of-box experience on the RGB30, and so everything is going to be basically the same. And I did a couple things just to verify that this operating system image seems to be the same as what you can find online. So for example, all the components and buttons work fine, same thing with Wi-Fi, so no problems there. In fact, the build ID of the Rocknix version that shipped with the device is the exact same of the most recent version as of making this video that I have loaded on my RGB30. And I was able to change the card out between the two, so that's pretty awesome that we have something that hasn't been messed around with by PowKiddy. And this is great for a couple reasons. Number one, the Rocknix developers won't have to make any special considerations for the RGB20SX. It should probably just work out of the box. And I can also use my games card interchangeably between the two, which means that I can swap my saves and the games themselves. All that'll work fine. And so I would say this is kind of an ideal experience in the fact that we have a top tier community software already shipping with the device, and you can just update it yourself as well. In addition, there are other community solutions for the RGB30 that'll also work on this device. For example, I took ArcOS and I put it in the same device and it booted up just fine, exactly the same as it was with an RGB30. And this is using a special software configuration that I showed off in a previous video where I simplified the entire process where you can just navigate through the box arts and then launch them from here. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll leave it linked down below, but I did want to confirm that yes, you can also do this on the RGB20SX. Okay, next we're going to discuss some of the issues with the RGB30 and see whether or not they have been resolved with the new model here. And we'll start with the whole charging thing, and this is very confusing, and so I'm just going to try to do my best. Number one, I tried a number of different PD fast chargers, 25, 45, 65, and 100 watts, and none of them would work on the device. This was not a surprise to me because it's the exact same with the RGB30. Now, if I use a standard USB-A to USB-C cable, this will show a flickering of a light, but then the light will go out. However, even though the light is not on, I found that it was still charging the device, and so this is a bit confusing. You would think that it would show a red light, but it did not. And so it does put a little bit of guesswork into whether or not your device is going to be fully charged and whether or not you can unplug it. I also tested with a USB-C to USB-C cable, but using a non-fast charger plug. And this one also did the same thing where it would charge, but the light wouldn't stay on. Now, just to make things more complicated, if you put the ArcOS SD card into your device and then plug it in, yes, the red light will come on and it'll stay on too. So there are a lot of charging factors here, and I would say that none of them are perfect, but it seems to be pretty similar to the RGB30. And from what I understand, a lot of this has to do with the chipset and not necessarily the software. Another common issue with the RK3566 chipset is that the battery readout will often be wrong, especially if you try to wake the device from sleep. For example, here you can see that it's only showing a 0% battery, when I know for a fact that it's probably around 95% right now. So yes, at the end of the day, it doesn't really seem like PowKiddy has made any improvements to the charging process, although I have heard they're using a new battery manufacturer now. And I think it'll take more time and testing to really understand whether or not that improves the overall charging experience. Now, besides the controls, the only other main issue that I have with the RGB30 is the fact that the device gets relatively warm as you're using it. And thankfully, I'm happy to say that this is not really an issue by design with the RGB20SX. Because they've put the CPU up top and the battery down below, we don't really have those heat issues. The RGB30 has an issue because the battery kind of acts like a heatsink. And so I think this is a great setup not only for the overall warmth of the device, but then also just the longevity of the battery life. And after about 4 hours straight of heavy use, I found that the top was just a little bit warm and the bottom was nice and cool. And so this is a big bonus for me in the fact that the device does not get warm like it does on the RGB30. Okay, now that we've taken a look at the controls and the shape and size and then some of these issues, let's now move into game testing and talk about what it's like to actually play this device. We'll start with a quick audio test just to give you an idea from this mono speaker. And honestly, this is kind of par for the course with these cheaper mono devices, and so no complaints here, but it's definitely not going to win any awards. So now let's move into our game testing, and we'll start with the more squarish aspect ratio devices, so things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And here I'm blowing these out to fill up the full screen so you can see just how big it is overall. And I think these games look brilliant on here. If you're looking for a really high resolution version of a Game Boy or Game Boy Color, I think you've come to the right place. And it's a very similar experience with the RGB30, but I do kind of like the fact that it's vertical for these systems in particular because it is a bit more fitting. Another system that works really well with the RGB30 and now the RGB20SX is Pico 8. This one has a square aspect ratio. And thankfully, the Rocknix operating system has support for the native Pico 8 app, so you can use this exactly like you would on a computer. That means that once you're connected to the internet, you can open up Explore and then you can shop around for games and download them directly onto the device. And this is exactly the same process of the RGB30, and that's one of my favorite things about that device in particular. And this one feels very similar to that, other than the fact that you're now playing it vertically. And it's kind of neat. I think this is a good novelty to be able to play some of these games vertically too. It's almost like turning this into a Pico 8 Game Boy, and it's not the same feeling with a horizontal handheld. Now, because of our square aspect ratio, there are going to be other consoles that play really well on this device. A great example would be vertical arcade games, including shoot 'em ups and then just your regular standard arcade games that had a vertical orientation back in the day. And again, this kind of feels like a novelty or a new sort of experience in that we can play these games vertically on a quote-unquote fake Game Boy. It's a little bit jarring at first to play these vertical games on a vertical handheld, but it's still pretty nice. Other systems that I think are a pretty good fit for it include other handhelds like the Game Gear as well as the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Both of these also had a squarish aspect ratio, and so they will fill up a lot of the screen, and it's very impressive as you're playing it. This screen is also a pretty good fit with Nintendo DS when you're playing games vertically. Now, often you may not need to see both screens at once, but this is just an example of what it's going to look like. Personally, I think it's a little bit small to try to play it like this, but you could definitely do it. Now, in my time with the RGB30 over the past 6 or 8 months, there have been a couple systems that I've really enjoyed the most, and the first is going to be Super Nintendo. For this particular setup, I like to play these games in an 8:7 aspect ratio with integer scaling on and then integer scale overscale turned on. This will ensure that we have nice square pixels, which I think look really chunky on this display, but then also that integer scale overscale doesn't really cut off that much on the left and right either. And so it's kind of an ideal situation. When you're playing games like this, there's basically nothing being cut out when it comes to the gameplay experience, but it's filling up the whole screen. And this is the exact same visual experience as the RGB30, and it looks just as good here. You can do the exact same setup with the TurboGrafx 16, same 8:7 aspect ratio and integer scale overscale. And so I found this to be an equally good experience when playing these games, especially because I haven't played a lot of this catalog. It's pretty neat to discover new games with this really nice big screen. Now for other consoles, I prefer to use a 4:3 aspect ratio, and NES is one of them. I know a lot of people prefer to play this in 8:7, but for me personally, I prefer 4:3 so that I can see everything on the left and right. What I generally will do is play it in 4:3 and then trim 8 pixels on the left and right, which gives me a good balance between seeing everything but then also having a pretty impressive display. And other 4:3 systems are going to look pretty good here too. Things like Sega Genesis, Sega CD, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast, all these are going to look fine. But I do have to admit that when playing 4:3 systems like this, it does make the top and bottom bezels a lot more apparent. Now these bezels were also there on the RGB30, but I didn't mind them as much, and that's mostly because the controls were on the left and right. But with a vertical orientation like this, it does kind of bother me that there is quite a big separation between the controls and the screen. We have those big black bars. And unfortunately, it gets exacerbated even more when you try to play a system that's wider. I think Game Boy Advance is probably about the furthest I would want to go on a square screen like this. This will make the top and bottom borders even larger, to the point where it gets even more distracting. And I also had a similar experience when playing Game Boy Advance on the Analog Pocket. This one would also have some pretty big black borders on the top and bottom, which were distracting during my gameplay. Now when playing these same games on the RGB30, I find it to be a different experience, and that's because, like I mentioned before, the controls are immediately to the left and right of the screen. And so even though yes, we do have those black borders on the top and bottom, they just kind of fade away for me. Instead, I can focus on the gameplay. In addition, Game Boy Advance is a perfect integer scale with this screen, and so as a result, we have some really nice chunky and crisp pixels too. And so I've always found that Game Boy Advance on this system in particular is a magical experience, just in the fact that it looks so good and the controls are so tight. And unfortunately, I do not find that to be the same experience on the RGB20SX. A little bit of that magic is gone. And it really just has to do with the awkwardness of having those bezels up at the top and bottom. If it's not going to bother you, then all good. But for me, it is something that kind of kept me from really enjoying it. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's my gaming experience with the RGB20SX. So let's move into the summary part, talk about what I like and what I don't like about this device. We're going to start with what I like, and there's quite a few things here. Number one, it does feel like there's an improved build quality with this device compared to others from PowKiddy. The texture of the plastic feels better, it's a little bit more gritty, but then also the plastic itself feels a little bit more thick and solid. And so I do like the fact that they've improved it, and I hope they continue to improve their products as time goes on. The other thing I love about this device, much like with the RGB30, is this screen. It is so good. 720 by 720 gives you a lot of room to work with when it comes to retro gaming. I also found the device to be pretty comfortable. It's rounded in all the right ways, and the positioning of the buttons is not half bad. It does feel balanced. I also appreciate the fact that this is basically a one-for-one copy of the RGB30, which means that custom firmwares that are made for that device will work on this device too. And it's not often that on a day one release we have all these different software options, but here with this device we have exactly that. Another factor I really appreciate about this device is that it does not get warm as you're playing it. That's one of my main complaints about the RGB30, and it's one of the things they've resolved with this vertical handheld. And I also think that with all the bells and whistles we have here, HDMI, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and a nice big screen, I think it justifies that $90 or below price point. And so I do think this device was priced appropriately at launch, and I bet it's just going to get cheaper from here. So those are all the things I like about the device. Let's talk about a couple of the things that I don't. We'll start with the D-pad. Unfortunately, this one is almost exactly the same as it was on RGB30, so no big improvements here. It still fails the contra test, and it will require some modding if you want it to be more accurate. Another thing I don't like about the device are the ski slope back buttons. I feel like these protrude just too much. If I had to guess, I would say the designers thought this would be more comfortable, but unfortunately I feel like it doesn't really actually add to the comfort of it, but makes it a lot less pocketable. I think the company that nailed these back buttons the best is actually on the Miyoo Mini Plus. These are flush with the device and also give you the full range of shoulder and trigger buttons too. They're definitely not the most comfortable buttons to use, but they get out of the way, which I think is more important, especially because with retro gaming, you're mostly going to be using these for hotkeys anyway. In fact, I would say I even prefer the Analog Pocket design over the RGB20SX. I like when the back buttons are more flush with the case. That means it's easier to get them in and out of your pocket. Next, another thing I didn't like about this device is that it felt just a little bit less magical than I was hoping for. And a lot of this has to do with the incongruity of the screen and the form factor. For example, yeah, it's it's pretty cool to be able to play vertical shooters on a vertical handheld like this. But it also gives me a feeling like this is just a taller experience than I would need. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I am just so used to playing the RGB30. This one has the exact same screen, so it's the same experience, but it feels way more compact. And I love the idea of having a handheld that has everything crammed into it in a smaller form factor. And I think in that regard, especially when it comes to something like a vertical shooter, the RGB30 is just a much more impressive fit. And it's the same thing with Super Nintendo. It is kind of a novelty to be able to play these games in such a big screen on a vertical handheld, but if I had a choice, I would rather play most of these games with a horizontal handheld because they feel more natural with something that's shaped more like the controller of an original Super Nintendo. And so for me, playing a game on the RGB30 where I tweak the settings to make everything perfectly fit within the screen and I've optimized all those pixels, it's a magical experience. And it's also kind of a magical experience on their RGB20SX, but I found it to be less so than the other. And I think this very much so comes down to whether or not you prefer to play games on a vertical device or a horizontal one. And that kind of leads to my last point, in that this feels like a very specific niche. In order to get the most out of this device, there are quite a few factors to make it fit. First, you have to really care about pixel balance and things like that in order to take the time and tweak everything just so. And on top of all of that, you also have to prefer a vertical handheld over a horizontal one. And there are definitely people out there who have been waiting for a vertical version of the RGB30, and I'm happy to say that yeah, here it is. I'm just not sure if there's enough people out there who prefer this very specific niche in order to justify having this device out there in the first place. And as I was testing this device over the past few days, I kept coming back to the same thought. And that was, why was this device made in the first place? And I think in order to really understand it, we have to look at the two biggest sellers from PowKiddy over the past couple years. On the left, we have the RGB20S, and this was a huge hit when it came out back in 2022. And this one sold like hotcakes, but it wasn't within the retro handheld community. Instead, this one got popular because of TikTok. There were a bunch of people who posted it, they went viral, and then all of a sudden everyone wanted these little Game Boys. And I'm not sure what really prompted that. Maybe it's the cute design with that tiger sticker, or maybe the fact that it was preloaded with a bunch of games. But there were a lot of people on TikTok who skewed towards a younger demographic who really enjoyed this device, and so it became one of the biggest sellers of the year. Now, on the other hand, the RGB30, which came out last year, was also a big hit for PowKiddy. But this one was a hit with a different community, and that was the retro handheld hobbyists. There are people like me who really appreciated the aspect ratio as well as the resolution of the screen and all of its potential. And so what I think PowKiddy did is they thought, okay, we've got this one on the left that was a huge seller, same thing with the one on the right, so let's put them together into one. But the thing is, I don't think that lightning is going to strike a third time with this one in particular. I think that the aspect ratio is just going to be a little bit weird for people who don't understand the hobby quite so well. And so I'm not very confident that this one will also be a viral hit on TikTok and with that same demographic. At the same time, we have hobbyists like me who can see the value of this screen, but we've also got a horizontal version that we like just fine. In the end, the RGB20SX is a success because it's exactly what it set out to be, and that is, it's a vertical version of the RGB30. The screen is really impressive in the right context, and if you are looking for a Game Boy-like device to play Game Boy-like games, this might be the best overall experience for under $100. It really is a shame that they didn't further improve on some of the RGB30's major flaws, but here we are. And when you put it all together, I consider the RGB20SX to be a slightly worse version of the RGB30. And that's mostly due to its overall awkwardness and because it has fewer contexts where it really hits home. It's still a magical device, but it just feels less magical than its horizontal counterpart. And so while I appreciate that there is now a vertical choice when it comes to the RGB30, I'm just not really sure how many people exactly are going to be looking for this. This handheld almost feels more like a solution without a problem, unless your very specific problem is that you want a vertical handheld with this screen. And when all those things are considered, the RGB20SX might just be a little bit too niche for me. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Have you been waiting for a vertical version of the RGB30, or is the horizontal one still the one for you? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.